Hi, I'm Stephanie, and I'm here with our Solutions and Innovations Director, Erik Vogt, to talk a little bit about this past event season. Now, we've had a lot of localization events in the past couple weeks, so I thought this would be a great time to connect with Erik, since he's been attending and speaking and moderating at a lot of these events, to sort of see what is the overall vibe that you've been getting.
Thanks, Steph. Yeah, it's a rare opportunity to be able to attend multiple events and look for the patterns between them. But we also have an opportunity to sort of get a pulse, both on session as well as in the hallways, in the dinners, in the opportunities to really deep dive into what people are working on. I think one of the big pictures was articulated perfectly by one participant who said there shouldn't be an AI track anymore. It's AI everywhere. It's involving us everywhere within our work. And we see several different primary channels. So we saw at LocWorld, for example, all the process innovation channels opportunities often are gravitating towards enhancing the AI as a language enhancement that improves a process for a worker, for a knowledge worker, primarily translators, who are going to be using this technology to get a better outcome. There's also AI as a way of improving, say, critical errors in long tail languages, which is another interesting trend, both at LocWorld and at Taos, where long tail is being explored. Like, how do we take what we know and drive that innovation to expand the base languages? And I think the long tail question is fascinating because it almost brings us back to the early 90s when there's certain things that are constraints, the data just isn't there. So there's AI everywhere. There's a rethinking of where humans fit in with that ecosystem. So this notion of, is the human in the loop, in which case you create a workflow in which there's a person in which enhances certain step. And there you constrain the step to a very specific task. And when you're thinking about this as a systems engineer, you think about making that very, very narrow. So you break down the task so that one person does a narrow task repetitively and efficiently. So we do this with translators. We ask them to sort of do this one thing, and we're doing everything else. But there's another way of thinking about it, which is putting a human in a ownership capacity. So now you think, instead of a translator who's like boxed into a particular task or maybe a review task, you're putting them into an ownership task, an ownership seat. Think about a brand champion. So you empower a person who understands the brand, understands what the goals of that brand are in a particular market, understands that market, and then can bring all these inputs together to sort of assess how to make better decisions. It is the same thing as that original source. But is that really designed? Is that really fit for use for that target audience? Are they really behaving or communicating in the way that this engine is designed to output? You could have a perfectly ISO compliant process that fails to meet your stakeholder goals or who you're trying to reach in that target market. So then you think, what if we put humans in the loop there, and you do the social listening, you do the synthesis at that stage, and you empower them to make a more of a creative choice in how they. So this is a pattern that I think we're seeing some signals about, and I think there's a huge potential to do more of that. As I've mentioned in our earlier marketing kind of discussion, there's much more opportunity there that we're not realizing. I think there's also certainly an interesting, I don't know, this is maybe just my vibe having done this for a lot of years, but you look at the aspirational presentations, which are designed to inspire, to sell, to sort of build awareness of a particular topic. So you look at what are they talking about? And I think one of the things that comes back a lot is, well, there's certainly the careers, roles, and skill changes needed in the industry. That often is part of it. We could talk about, but I'm also reminded that the basics are so important. Like, even though we have the sophisticated AI capabilities, we still need to remember that terminology, kind of core linguistic intelligence, core data infrastructure is really important. So you talk to a terminologist and they'll tell you about how important it is to get your terminology straight. And then you think, okay, we look at TMSs and they're mainly focused on commercial leveraging of previous effort. And now you move to Gen AI, and now it gets back to how important terminology is again, because if you can create a framework for the right terminology, you can bias the models to generate content that's consistent with that core capability. So these are just some of the high level trends that we're seeing. I think there's certainly anxiety, but I think you'll probably see this from other commentators on this well. It feels less like a revolution and more like an iteration and an evolution, where
Yeah.
it's less about it's everything's going to change all of a sudden to it's changing already substantively and in increments. There's this quote, right, about how things change slower but more profoundly than you realize. I think we are
Mhm.
in that phase where a lot of the hype bubble is maybe popping. We've realized some of the stuff isn't quite as flashy or instant, and quietly, it's actually making meaningful and real change that's profoundly changing the shape of the market, and it's affecting individuals very differently.
Yeah. So it sounds like AI, of course, has kind of been figured out, and now we're having these incremental changes. And the human is going to be fitting in lots of different ways. So, what's left? What are the other big questions that you've been hearing people ask at these different conferences?
So many. One is that one thing a kind of light bulb went off in my head at one point, where I was thinking about AI is pretty good at translating general stuff, just prosaic sentences, pretty darn good. But really, for tier one languages, let's say top 10, does mostly good at general content, top 10. The further you go to tier two, tier three, tier four, it gets worse and worse as the amount of data available diminishes. You also see a diminishing value as it goes from general to specific. And it's almost the exact same issue. The amount of data is less. So you think about an individual client who's trying to use AI in their particular case, it has the exact same constraints as the long tail languages do, which is
Mm.
lack of data, lack of clarity, lack of structure. There's lack of terminology structure. There's lacks of kind of the core language definition of that language. You need to agree on what the concepts are sometimes, even before you get. So take a long tail language where you're trying to translate into something. I just saw a play over the weekend where they were describing how the indigenous American people interpreted a horse because they hadn't seen one before, and they didn't have a word for a horse. So how would an interpreter sort of explain what a horse was to somebody who'd never seen a horse before? That is true for a lot of long tail languages. They just simply don't have words for some of these things that you need to. They don't have a grammatical structure that you can be compliant to. They don't have like established dictionaries. If you don't have those established dictionaries and those core structures defined, then it's very difficult to get the consistency that you expect for your brand voice at scale, like your target audience. In Taos, which started off as the Translation Automation User Society, I think it's been around for a while, and it started off with trying to automate the translation experience, and data was is the most important thing. That data becomes the thing that you're really trying to get the most out of, as well as all the tools you need to control the output. So interesting, the more things change, the more they remain the same. Some of these things are still there. Now, I'll tell you what's missing. What should we have seen that we didn't see? There's a multidisciplinary aspect to deploying AI that I think is underutilized. We tend, as practitioners, to focus on what we need to do and try to use AI to do it better, as opposed to looking at what you can do with AI that you can't do right now. So take into consideration marketing, because I kind of like thinking about this. Marketing is a big driver of our entire industry. If you have this human champion person who you've empowered with inputs, you end up with a scenario where you're generating output that is not the same per language. It's fundamentally different per language. You can have a target in Korea, which is totally different content, but same core bullets, like the same mission objective, the same core capabilities, but delivered to an entirely different sort of way of thinking about things. Positivity versus negativity. You have collectivist versus individualist societies. You have different sort of cultural ethos that many thinkers in our industry are trying to bring awareness to. It's just not carbon copying the English source into massive languages, but rather generating content in source that really fits that particular market's need while still retaining some degree of control over it. Let's start with Microsoft as one of the originators of this. They really wanted to kind of build the same product and then make it available for all these other markets. Now, all the industry, all the volume and scale problems that you're focused on when you're going to, let's say, 25 languages, That's a scale problem, not an individual customization problem. And in many cases, enablement is all you got there. You can read it in that language, and that's it. As we start dealing with things like cultural change or evolution of language or sort of refinement of capabilities that need to be more custom per language, our system breaks because we just can't do both scale and customization very well at the same time. I would have liked to see more cross disciplinary challenges where we use Gen AI to target markets differently using this generative AI capability than it would otherwise. Another big thing that I think Arlie mentioned this at one point during Taos was mentioning the fundamental shifts in our industry. Top line revenue is dropping, it seems, and we can't really see the number of translators who are employed by our ecosystem. We don't really have a mechanism for that. We don't measure how many hours of translator time we're buying as an industry per person. It's very difficult. They're largely contractors, they're getting paid by the word. We don't have a centralized sort of way of looking at this. We do see there's an astronomical spike in the amount of content that's being translated because automatic translation unblocks this enormous potential. And there is a displacement, especially for tier one languages, where there's I believe, a fewer number of total units being purchased. And there's a disconnect between cognitive load and the effort required. There's a story about the translators. We want to pay them more, but we want them to do the truly human things. Those things, the translators are getting, could still get paid more and still quit because now we're only having them do the really, really hard things and we're doing all the automated easy stuff. How is the work blend changing? There may be less top line revenue, but maybe there's more content moderation, or maybe there's more reviewing Gen AI output for accuracy instead. I don't really think that's a big part of our business yet, but I think it could be. And how are we self-siloing to not realize that there are similar problems being solved in related fields that we're not open to because we're trying to do our own thing better and our own thing is kind of defined by the scope of these conferences. So in what way might there be blind spots for us where we're not realizing that these other systems interacting with each other is where the great innovations of the next stage of our industry and our community, I'll call it a community instead of an industry, so that we really can see much, much more potential. So in a nutshell, I'm all about solutions design. I'm all about looking at the big picture. I'm all about sort of looking at the way systems interoperate with each other. I think there's a lot that we could do more to look at how these systems interact with each other, not just how individuals have optimized a core capability of something that they already do well, which I think is already on track to do great things. So.
Yeah. Okay. Well, any final thoughts, impressions that we haven't covered yet?
Well, conferences are a good opportunity for people to get together to share ideas. I often have a sort of mixed feelings about which is more valuable. Is it what you see on stage, or is what you see when you connect with people in the hallways? I think this year probably I would err on the second category, where if you just sit down at a table with any random group of people and just start a conversation about what you're doing, you're going to learn almost as much as you can on stage now, just because so much is happening that's not formal. It's
Hmm.
more informal and it's more adaptive. And I'm looking forward to conversations with our clients and with my peers in the industry to continue exploring ways that we can look for the blind spots and reveal ways of rethinking fundamental assumptions about what we're trying to do. What is the business purpose of what we're trying to do together? Can we look more systematically at looking at this with a fresh pair of eyes? How can we rebuild with the component parts that we have new and innovative ways of solving the core issue, which is communication, reaching your audience, listening to your audience, informing, educating, entertaining. All these things are part of our role as an industry, and it's wonderful to kind of blend all these ideas together in a cauldron and see what bubbles up out of it.
Yes, indeed. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Erik.
Thank you very much, Steph.